The massive starship glided through the void of space, its sleek hull reflecting the distant starlight as it approached the crystalline world of Aetheria Prime. Inside, Commander Lee Daho stood before the viewport, watching as the alien planet grew larger with each passing moment. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and anxiety as he straightened his diplomatic uniform for the 100th time. "First time seeing an Aetherian world?" asked Captain Song, her weathered face breaking into a knowing smile. She had transported countless diplomats to various alien worlds, but there was something different about this young commander. "Is it that obvious?" Daho replied, running his fingers through his dark hair. At 32, he was the youngest diplomatic attaché ever sent to represent Earth at the Aetherian court. Some had called it a mistake. Others suggested it was a calculated risk. Either way, here he was. The planet below them was unlike anything in human space. Its surface shimmered with vast fields of natural crystals that caught and reflected the light of its star, creating an ever-changing rainbow across its continents. The oceans gleamed with a deep purple hue, and the clouds that swirled in its atmosphere had a peculiar silvery tinge. "Don't worry too much," Captain Song said, patting his shoulder. "The Aetherians might look different, but they're not unreasonable. Just stick to your training and remember, they value honesty above all else." Daho nodded, though his stomach was doing flips as the ship began its descent. He had spent months preparing for this assignment, studying everything known about Aetherian culture and customs. Still, no amount of research could fully prepare him for what awaited. The Royal Spaceport was a marvel of engineering and art combined. Crystal spires rose hundreds of meters into the air, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move in the light. As the ship touched down, Daho caught his first glimpse of the Aetherians themselves through the viewport. They were tall, easily 7 feet on average, with skin that seemed to shimmer like mother of pearl. Their movements were graceful, almost musical, and the crystalline growths that adorned their heads caught the light in mesmerizing ways. The diplomatic briefings hadn't done them justice. "Remember," Captain Song said as they prepared to disembark, "you're not just representing Earth. You're representing humanity. Make us proud." The air that hit Daho's face as he stepped onto Aetherian soil was cool and carried a slight metallic taste. A delegation of Aetherian officials waited at the bottom of the ship's ramp, their formal robes flowing in the gentle breeze. Leading them was Minister Rin, the equivalent of their Foreign Affairs Director. "Commander Lee," Minister Rin spoke in perfect English, her voice carrying musical undertones that seemed to resonate in Daho's chest. "Welcome to Aetheria Prime. We trust your journey was comfortable." "Very much so, Minister Rin," Daho replied, carefully executing the greeting gesture he had practiced countless times. His hand moved in a sweeping arc, fingers spread in what he hoped was the correct pattern. To his relief, the minister's expression brightened. "Your study of our ways is noted and appreciated," she said, returning the gesture with fluid grace. "Come. The Queen awaits your arrival in the Crystal Court." The journey to the palace was a blur of crystal towers and floating platforms that served as public transportation. Aetherian citizens stopped to watch their procession, their silver eyes curious but not unfriendly. Children pointed and whispered, clearly fascinated by the human in their midst. The Crystal Court itself was beyond anything Daho had imagined. The main hall was carved from a single massive crystal, its walls rising in elegant spirals that caught and amplified the natural light. The effect was both beautiful and slightly disorienting, as the light seemed to dance and shift with every movement. "Wait here," Minister Rin instructed, leaving Daho in the company of 2 silent guards. Their armor was unlike anything he had seen in the briefings, living crystal that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their breathing. The minutes stretched on, and Daho found himself fighting the urge to pace. This was the moment he had prepared for. The first real test of his abilities as a diplomat would be his presentation to Queen Era, sovereign of the Aetherian Empire. A soft chime rang through the hall, and the assembled Aetherians all turned toward the grand entrance. Daho's breath caught in his throat as Queen Era made her entrance. She moved like living music, each step precise yet flowing into the next. Her crown was a masterpiece of living crystal that seemed to respond to her thoughts, shifting and changing colors subtly as she approached. But it was her eyes that caught and held Daho's attention. They were not the typical silver of her people, but a swirling galaxy of colors that seemed to look right through him. Commander Lee of Earth, her voice carried through the hall without seeming to need amplification. We have heard much of your world and your people. Step forward and be recognized. Daho approached the throne, his steps measured and careful on the crystal floor. He had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times, but standing before her now, all his practice seemed inadequate. As he performed the formal greeting, time seemed to slow. He saw her eyes widen slightly, saw the crown upon her head pulse with a new pattern of light. Later, he would learn that his greeting had been perfect, too perfect, carrying subtle meanings he couldn't have known. "Rise, Commander," Queen Eris said, and was that amusement in her voice. "Your presence honors us. We look forward to learning more about Earth through your eyes." The formal reception continued, but Daho couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. He didn't yet know that his perfect execution of the greeting, learned from outdated recordings and ancient texts, had sent ripples through the court that would soon become waves. That evening, alone in his assigned quarters in the diplomatic wing, Daho stood at the window watching the twin moons rise over the crystal city. The events of the day played through his mind as he tried to make sense of the subtle reactions he had noticed during the reception. A soft chime announced a message on his communication panel. It was from Minister Rin. "Your performance today was unexpected. The Queen requests your presence at tomorrow morning's private audience. Be prepared, Commander. You have caught the attention of the court in ways you may not yet understand." Daho read the message 3 times, trying to determine if it was a good thing or not. As he finally prepared for sleep, the last thing he saw was the reflection of Aetheria's moons in the crystal towers, creating patterns that seemed to dance like the lights in Queen Era's crown. He couldn't have known then that his first day on Aetheria Prime had set in motion events that would change both their worlds forever. But as he drifted off to sleep, some part of him sensed that his life had already begun to change in ways he could never have predicted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, and the beginning of an adventure that no diplomatic training could have prepared him for. But for now, Commander Lee Daho slept, while outside his window, the crystal city sang its ancient songs to the stars. Morning came too quickly on Aetheria Prime, with its violet sun casting strange shadows through the crystal architecture. Daho had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the private audience with Queen Era. He stood before the mirror in his quarters, adjusting his formal attire and practicing the greeting gestures one more time. A gentle chime at his door announced the arrival of his assigned cultural advisor, an Aetherian named Liz. She stood nearly 2 heads taller than him, her pearl-like skin shimmering in the morning light. "Commander Lee," she said, her voice carrying that musical quality all Aetherians seem to possess, "are you prepared for today's lessons? We have much to cover before your audience with Her Majesty." Daho nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. "I've been practicing the morning greetings since dawn." Liz tilted her head, her crystal crown catching the light. "Show me." He performed the sequence of gestures he had memorized, moving his hands in what he thought was a perfect recreation of the traditional morning welcome. Liz's expression shifted to one of barely contained amusement. "Commander," she said gently, "you just declared your intention to purchase a herd of crystal grazers and start a farming colony." Daho's face flushed, "But I followed the instruction manual exactly." "Ah," Liz sighed, "you've been using the diplomatic guide from the first contact era. Our language of gesture has evolved since then. Here, watch carefully." The next hour was spent learning the correct modern versions of even the simplest greetings. Every minor movement of fingers, every angle of the wrist, carried meaning that could completely change the intent of the communication. By the time they finished the basic morning greetings, Daho's head was spinning. Now, Liz said, we must hurry. The Queen's private audience chamber uses traditional lighting patterns. Each pattern indicates appropriate topics of conversation. You must not discuss military matters under blue light or trade agreements under green. As they walked through the palace corridors, Daho tried to absorb the rapid-fire instructions. What about red light? Oh no, Liz's crystalline crown flickered with alarm. We never use red light in the presence of the Queen. That would be. She searched for the right word. Unfortunate. They arrived at the audience chamber just as the palace chronometer chimed the hour. Two guards stood at attention, their living armor pulsing in sync with their heartbeats. Liz gave Daho one final look of encouragement before departing. The chamber doors opened silently, revealing a space that seemed to defy physics. Crystal walls caught and reflected light in complex patterns, creating an ever-changing atmosphere that made Daho's eyes struggle to adjust. Queen Era sat on a simple crystal throne, her crown throwing rainbow patterns across the room. Commander Lee, she spoke, her voice carrying that same musical quality, but with an added depth that made the crystals in the room resonate. You seem troubled this morning. Daho began the greeting sequence Liz had just taught him. Halfway through, he realized the lighting had shifted from purple to gold, which meant, what did it mean? He faltered, his hand froze in mid-gesture. The Queen's eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement. Please continue. Your attempts to honor our ways are refreshing. He completed the gesture, though he was certain he'd made at least 3 cultural faux pas in the process. Your Majesty, I apologize for any offense. Offense? She leaned forward slightly, her crown shimmering with new patterns. You have caused no offense, though I must admit, your declaration of intent to become a crystal grazer herder was unexpected. Daho wanted to sink through the crystal floor. You saw that. I see much that happens in my court, she replied. Tell me, Commander, why did you choose diplomatic service? The lighting shifted to a soft blue-green, and Daho's mind raced to remember what topics were appropriate. Personal history, career choices, or was this the lighting that restricted conversation to weather patterns and agricultural reports? He began, deciding to risk honesty. I believe that understanding between different peoples was the most important work one could do. Queen Era's crown pulsed with a pattern he hadn't seen before, even when that understanding proves difficult to achieve. Especially then, he replied, forgetting for a moment all the protocol and simply speaking from his heart. The harder it is to understand each other, the more important it becomes to try. The chamber's lighting shifted again, this time to a color he couldn't quite name. The Queen's expression changed subtly, but he couldn't read the meaning behind it. You are unlike the other diplomats we have hosted, she said finally. They arrived with perfect knowledge of our protocols, never making mistakes, never showing uncertainty. Yet somehow, they understood us less than you do now, with all your imperfect gestures and honest confusion. Daho wasn't sure if this was praise or criticism. I have much to learn about your ways. Yes, she agreed, but perhaps we also have something to learn from your way of approaching the unknown. Tell me on Earth, how do you indicate respect without the use of crystal resonance patterns? The question caught him off guard. Well, we show it in many ways. Through words, through actions, through simply taking the time to listen and understand. Fascinating. The Queen mused. And when you make a mistake in your interactions, we apologize and try to do better next time. So simple, she said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but, yet effective, in its way. The audience continued for another hour, during which Daho managed to accidentally propose a trade agreement during what he later learned was the lighting pattern reserved for discussing art, suggested a military alliance while the lights indicated it was time for discussing poetry, and somehow implied that Earth's main export was dancing vegetables. Yet strangely, the Queen seemed more engaged than offended by his cultural blunders. Each mistake led to discussions about the differences between their peoples, conversations that felt more genuine than any perfectly executed diplomatic exchange. As he left the chamber, thoroughly exhausted and certain his diplomatic career was over, he heard one of the guards make a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Liz was waiting outside, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said, "that was a disaster." Daho suggested. "Interesting," she finished. "The Queen has requested you join her for the evening meal ceremony. This is unprecedented for a junior diplomat. Is that good or bad?" Liz's crown flickered with colors he couldn't interpret. "It is interesting," she repeated, "though perhaps you should review the dining protocols before then. Unless you wish to accidentally challenge the entire royal court to a traditional crystal harvesting competition." Daho groaned. "That's possible. With your current grasp of our gestural language." Liz's musical voice carried a definite note of amusement now. "Commander, I believe you could accidentally declare yourself the reincarnation of our first emperor without even realizing it." As they walked back to the diplomatic quarters for more lessons, Daho couldn't shake the feeling that his complete failure to navigate Aetherian culture perfectly had somehow accomplished more than any amount of perfect protocol could have. He just hoped he could make it through dinner without starting an interplanetary incident. Behind them, in the private audience chamber, Queen Era watched their departure through the crystal walls, her crown pulsing with patterns that would have told any Aetherian observer that something very interesting indeed was beginning to unfold. The grand hall of the Crystal Palace shimmered with 1,000 lights as Daho made his way through the crowd of gathered dignitaries. The Festival of Crystal Blooms was in full swing, with Aetherians of all ranks dressed in their finest attire, their crystal crowns creating a dazzling display of shifting colors. After 3 months on Aetheria Prime, he had finally started to feel more comfortable with their customs, or so he thought. "Remember," Liz whispered at his side, her own crown pulsing with gentle concern, "today's ceremony is one of our most sacred traditions. The Queen will personally bless the new crystal growths in the royal gardens." Daho nodded, trying to recall all the protocols for this particular event. He had spent the entire previous week practicing the proper gestures. The traditional greeting for the festival was supposedly one of the most ancient in Aetherian culture, dating back to their first dynasty. "You seem nervous, Commander," came a familiar voice. Minister Rin approached them, her formal robes catching the light in hypnotic patterns. "Surely you've mastered enough of our ways by now to handle a simple blessing ceremony." "Simple isn't quite the word I'd use," Daho replied with a small smile. Despite his initial struggles, he had developed a friendly rapport with the minister. "Every time I think I understand your customs, I discover another layer of meaning I hadn't considered." Rin's crown flickered with what he had learned to recognize as amusement. "Yet your unique interpretations of our ways have proven refreshingly insightful. The Queen speaks often of your unconventional perspective." Before Daho could respond to this surprising revelation, a series of crystal chimes rang through the hall. The assembled crowd moved with practiced grace to form a ceremonial circle around the central platform. Above them, the crystal dome of the palace had been aligned to catch the light of both moons, creating an ethereal pattern across the floor. "It's time," Liz whispered urgently. "Remember, when the Queen approaches, you must perform the blessing of new growth. The gesture must be precise. It symbolizes the eternal cycle of crystal formation." Daho took his position among the other diplomats, his heart racing. He had practiced this particular gesture hundreds of times. It was complex, involving a specific sequence of hand movements that mimicked the natural growth patterns of Aetherian crystals. The crowd fell silent as Queen Era entered the hall. Her appearance drew gasps of appreciation. Her ceremonial robes seemed to be made of living crystal, shifting and flowing with each movement. Her crown had been augmented for the occasion, rising in delicate spires that caught and amplified the moonlight. As she passed each section of the gathering, its members performed their ritual greetings. Daho watched carefully, noting how each group's gesture varied slightly according to their rank and position in society. When she approached the diplomatic section, his moment had come. Time seemed to slow as he began the gesture. His right hand moved in what he believed was the pattern of new growth. Fingers spread to represent the branching of crystal formations. His left hand followed in a complementary motion, completing the symbol of eternal cycles. The silence that fell over the hall was absolute. Daho's first indication that something had gone wrong was Liz's sharp intake of breath beside him. The second was the way Queen Era's crown suddenly blazed with intense light, patterns racing across its surface in a display he had never seen before. Minister Rin's expression had changed from diplomatic calm to complete shock. Around the hall, Aetherian nobles were either staring in disbelief or engaging in urgent whispered conversations behind their hands. "Commander," Liz's voice was barely audible. "What did you practice with?" "The ancient texts you gave me," he whispered back, growing increasingly concerned by the continuing silence. "The ones about traditional festival greetings." "Which volume?" "The Red Crystal Archive, Section 12. Liz's crown flickered with what might have been panic. "Section 12. That wasn't. Those weren't festival greetings. Those were." She never finished her sentence because at that moment, Queen Era moved. Every eye in the hall followed her as she approached Daho with measured steps. Her expression was unreadable, but her crown was creating patterns of light that made the older Aetherians in the crowd press their hands to their mouths in astonishment. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the swirling colors in her eyes. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then, to everyone's apparent shock, she raised her hands and began a series of precise, flowing movements. The patterns of light from her crown intensified, creating a dome of shifting colors above them both. Minister Rin made a sound that might have been a gasp of disbelief. Liz swayed slightly on her feet. "Commander Lee," Queen Era's voice carried clearly through the silent hall, "you continue to surprise us." Daho's throat felt dry. "Your Majesty, I fear I may have made a mistake in my greeting." "A mistake?" The corner of her mouth curved slightly. "You performed the sacred proposal of the First Dynasty perfectly. Every gesture, every nuance, exactly as it was recorded in our most ancient texts. A ritual unseen in public for over 3 centuries. The words took a moment to register. When they did, Daho felt the blood drain from his face. The sacred proposal. Indeed, she confirmed, her crown still creating that extraordinary light show above them. And I have just given the traditional response of acceptance. The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles were talking all at once, their crowns creating a storm of conflicting light patterns. Minister Rin appeared to be torn between diplomatic crisis management and outright laughter. Liz had her face buried in her hands. Daho struggled to find words appropriate for the situation. How did one apologize for accidentally proposing to an alien queen in front of her entire court? But Queen Era's expression wasn't angry. If anything, she appeared to be fighting back amusement. "Perhaps," she said, pitched for his ears alone, "we should discuss this development in private. After all, it would be improper to plan our union in front of the entire court." As she turned to address the still chaotic gathering, Daho caught a glimpse of something in her expression that made him wonder, just for a moment, if his mistake had been quite as unexpected as everyone assumed. The Festival of Crystal Blooms would go down in Aetherian history as the most memorable in centuries, though not for the reasons anyone had anticipated. And as Daho was led away by a very flustered Liz to review proper ceremonial protocols immediately, he couldn't shake the feeling that his diplomatic career had just taken a turn that no training manual could have possibly prepared him for. Behind him, Queen Era watched his departure with an expression that would have told any experienced Aetherian observer that perhaps, just perhaps, some ancient texts had found their way into the commander's study materials not entirely by accident. The morning after the Festival of Crystal Blooms dawned in chaos. Daho sat in his quarters, surrounded by frantic Earth diplomats who had arrived via emergency faster than light transmission. Their voices overlapped as they tried to make sense of the situation. "Let me understand this correctly," Ambassador Park said, pressing her fingers to her temples. "You accidentally proposed marriage to the queen of the most powerful crystalline empire in the galaxy, and she accepted." In my defense, Daho replied weakly, "I thought I was performing a traditional festival greeting. A greeting that just happened to be an ancient proposal ritual." Another diplomat asked, his voice rising an octave. "How did you even find such an obscure ceremony?" Before Daho could answer, a gentle chime announced a visitor. The door slid open to reveal Minister Rin, her crown pulsing with what he had learned to recognize as barely contained amusement. "Commander Lee," she said, ignoring the cluster of Earth diplomats, "Her Majesty requests your presence in the private gardens. Alone." The Earth diplomats erupted in protests, but Minister Rin silenced them with a gesture. "This is not a request open to negotiation. The sacred proposal has been given and accepted. By our most ancient laws, the betrothed must have their first private audience before dawn's third chime." Daho stood, straightening his uniform. "What happens if we don't follow this tradition?" The last time such protocols were ignored, 3 moons ago, it triggered a 50-year period of mourning. Rin's crown flickered with something that might have been mischief. "We had to wear black crystals. It was most unfashionable." The Earth diplomats fell silent at this. Ambassador Park gave Daho a resigned nod. "Try not to cause an interstellar incident." Well, another one. The private gardens were unlike anything Daho had seen before. Crystal flowers bloomed in impossible colors, their petals chiming softly in the morning breeze. Queen Era stood among them, her ceremonial robes replaced by simpler attire that somehow made her seem more, not less, regal. "Commander," she greeted him, her voice carrying its usual musical quality. "Or perhaps I should say, my betrothed." Daho felt his face heat. "Your Majesty, about last night. I need to explain that you found our most sacred texts, perfectly memorized an ancient ritual, and performed it flawlessly by accident." Her crown sparkled with what he now recognized as amusement. "Tell me, Commander, do you believe in coincidences?" "I'm starting to doubt them," he admitted. "The texts Lies gave me were from the private royal library," Era finished, "a section that only the Queen can authorize access to." Understanding began to dawn. "You planned this." "Planned." She touched a crystal flower, making it chime softly. "No, I merely created an opportunity. You chose to take it, albeit unknowingly." "But why?" Era turned to face him fully, her eyes swirling with colors he had never seen before. "In 3 months, you have done what centuries of careful diplomacy could not. Your mistakes have brought more understanding between our peoples than all the perfect protocols ever achieved. By getting everything wrong. By being genuine," she corrected. "Your efforts to understand us, your willingness to risk embarrassment to learn our ways, your honest reactions when things go wrong. These showed us something about humans that all the careful diplomatic presentations never could." A crystal bird landed nearby, its crystalline wings creating musical notes as it moved. Daho watched it, trying to process everything. "The alliance this could create between our peoples," he began, "is important," Era agreed, "but not my primary concern. Tell me, Commander, in your studies of our culture, did you learn why the sacred proposal fell into disuse?" He shook his head. "Because it was the last ceremony we had that couldn't be performed perfectly through mere practice. It required genuine intent, true connection. In all the centuries since, no one has performed it correctly by accident." Her crown created patterns he had never seen before. "Until you." "But I didn't have any intent. I didn't even know what I was doing." "Exactly," she smiled. "Your heart performed the ritual while your mind was unaware. Do you know how rare that is among my people? We are beings of crystal and pattern, of careful thought and measured action. You showed us something different." A chime rang through the garden, marking the 3rd hour of dawn. Era stepped closer, her presence making the crystals around them resonate. I am not asking you to accept this match, she said softly. The laws allow for a period of consideration. But know that my acceptance was not merely political, nor was it truly instantaneous. I have watched you these past months, seen how you face each challenge with determination and honesty. Daeho looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without the weight of protocol and position between them. He saw intelligence, humor, and something else in those swirling eyes. Loneliness, perhaps. What happens now? He asked. Now. Her crown created a pattern that rippled through the garden, making all the crystal flowers chime in harmony. Now we begin the traditional period of courtship, unless you wish to trigger another 50 years of black crystals. Despite everything, Daeho found himself laughing. We wouldn't want that. The fashion disaster alone would probably start a war. Her answering laugh made the crystals sing. In that moment, watching the impossible colors dance in her eyes, Daeho realized that of all his diplomatic mistakes, this might turn out to be the most fortunate one of all. As they walked through the garden, discussing the chaos their unexpected engagement would cause, neither noticed Minister Rin watching from a distance, her crown creating the ancient pattern that meant all goes according to design. The morning light caught in the crystal flowers, creating rainbows that danced around the unlikely couple, the human diplomat who couldn't get anything right, and the alien queen who had been waiting for exactly that kind of wonderful imperfection. The news of the engagement spread across both Earth and Etheria Prime like wildfire. In the grand conference chamber of the Crystal Palace, Daeho sat through his 10th emergency meeting of the day, watching as holograms of Earth officials argued with their Aetherian counterparts about protocols, precedents, and possibilities. "This is unprecedented," declared the Earth's Secretary of Interstellar Relations, his holographic form pacing back and forth. A human marrying the Queen of the Aetherian Empire. The political ramifications alone are precisely why this union is so fascinating, interrupted Minister Rin, her crown creating patterns of diplomatic interest. Think of the possibilities for both our peoples. Daeho remained quiet, observing as the debate continued. Queen Era sat beside him, her presence causing the very crystals in the walls to resonate softly. She seemed more amused than concerned by the political storm they had created. The trade implications alone are staggering, one of the Earth's economic advisors was saying, frantically pulling up charts and projections. The Aetherian Empire controls 70% of known crystal-based technology resources. A formal union between our worlds could revolutionize Earth's technological capabilities. And let us not forget, added an Aetherian noble, his crown flickering with excitement, the human's unique understanding of biological systems could advance our medical sciences by centuries. The meeting had been going on for hours, with both sides gradually shifting from panic to cautious optimism as they began to realize the potential benefits of this accidental diplomatic coup. Daeho caught Queen Era hiding a small smile behind her hand as another Earth official launched into an enthusiastic speech about cultural exchange programs. Commander Lee called out Ambassador Park, bringing his attention back to the discussion. "You've been remarkably quiet. Do you have any thoughts on these developments?" All eyes turned to him, both physical and holographic. Daeho straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of two civilizations' expectations on his shoulders. "I think," he said carefully, "that we're all missing something important here. Yes, the political and economic benefits are significant, but there's something more fundamental at work." Queen Era's crown pulsed with interest as he continued. "The Aetherians value precision, pattern, and perfection. We humans often succeed through adaptation, improvisation, and what looks like chaos to others. This union, accidental as it may have been, proves that these seemingly opposite approaches can not only coexist but complement each other." The chamber fell silent as both sides considered his words. Minister Rin's crown created a pattern he had never seen before, something that made the older Aetherian nobles murmur in approval. "Well said." Queen Era spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Perhaps this is why the ancient proposal ritual required true connection rather than perfect execution. It saw beyond the surface differences to the potential beneath. The Earth officials exchanged glances, while the Aetherian nobles' crowns flickered with rapid calculations and considerations. The atmosphere in the room had shifted subtly. There is, of course, the matter of succession to consider, one of the Aetherian council members mentioned delicately. The genetic compatibility between our species has already been thoroughly studied. Minister Rin interrupted smoothly. Our scientific division has been researching human Aetherian biological integration since the commander's arrival. The results are promising. Daho turned to look at Queen Era, raising an eyebrow. She gave him a small shrug that seemed to say, "I may have been planning ahead." The meeting continued well into the evening, with both sides gradually moving from crisis management to enthusiastic planning. Trade agreements were drafted, cultural exchange programs were proposed, and joint scientific ventures were outlined. What had started as a diplomatic incident was rapidly transforming into the most significant interstellar alliance in human history. As the last of the Earth officials signed off and the Aetherian nobles filed out, Daho remained in his seat, slightly overwhelmed by everything that had transpired. Feeling overwhelmed? Queen Era asked, her voice carrying that musical quality that still made his heart skip. "A bit," he admitted. "When I joined the diplomatic service, I never imagined I'd end up helping forge an alliance by accidentally proposing to an alien queen." Accidentally. Minister Rin's voice carried a note of amusement as she gathered her documents. "Commander, in all my years of service, I've never seen so many accidents work out so perfectly." As they left the conference chamber, the crystal walls humming with residual energy from the day's discussions, Daho noticed something unusual. The patterns in Queen Era's crown, which he had learned to read quite well over the past months, were showing signs of both triumph and relief. "You know," he said as they walked through the corridors, "for someone who just had their carefully planned diplomatic coup exposed, you seem rather pleased with yourself." Era's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Perhaps I simply appreciate the irony. The most significant alliance in our history, born from a human's inability to follow our protocols perfectly. You planned for the alliance," he guessed, "but not necessarily for this particular outcome." "Let's just say I created the conditions for possibility," she replied. "You did the rest by being perfectly imperfect." Behind them, Minister Rin's crown created the pattern for "all according to design," before quickly shifting to a more diplomatic display. The political implications of their union were still unfolding, but perhaps that was the beauty of it. Like the joining of crystal clarity and human chaos, the outcome would be something entirely new and unexpected. As they reached the royal gardens, the twin moons of Aetheria Prime cast their light through the crystal flowers, creating a symphony of color and sound. It was a perfect metaphor, Daho thought, for what their union represented, the harmonious blending of two very different ways of seeing the universe. Deep in the royal gardens of the Crystal Palace, Daho sat with Queen Era, beneath a canopy of singing crystal flowers. It had been a week since their engagement was announced, and they were finally taking time to know each other beyond politics and protocols. "So," Era said, her crown creating gentle patterns in the evening light, "tell me about Earth's oceans. I've seen images, but I want to hear how you experienced them." Daho smiled, remembering the beaches of his homeland. "They're constantly changing. No two waves are exactly the same. The water shifts from deep blue to green to gray depending on the sky above. It's beautiful chaos." "Chaos?" Her crown flickered with curiosity. "We have seas on Aetheria Prime, but they follow precise patterns. The waves rise and fall in mathematical sequences." "That sounds beautiful too, but different. Earth's oceans are unpredictable. Sometimes they're calm enough to see your reflection. Other times they're powerful enough to reshape coastlines." Era leaned forward, genuinely fascinated. "Like your people, always changing, adapting, surprising. It took me months to understand that what we saw as human inconsistency was actually your greatest strength. And it took me just as long to realize that what we saw as Aetherian rigidity was actually a different kind of adaptability. Daho replied, "Your patterns aren't just about maintaining order. They're about understanding the underlying structure of things." A crystal bird landed nearby, its wings creating delicate music. Ara reached out, and the creature hopped onto her finger, its crystalline form resonating with her crown. "You see," she said softly, "most off-worlders assume our crystal life forms are simple automatons, following programmed patterns, but you notice they respond to emotion, to connection." Daho watched as the bird trilled a unique melody. Like when they changed their songs during my first week here. I thought I was imagining it, but they were adapting their patterns to include notes from earth music I was humming. Exactly. Era's crown blazed with excitement. "That's what made me first notice you. Not your diplomatic skills, which were honestly terrible, but your ability to see beyond surface patterns to deeper meanings." They both laughed at the memory of his early diplomatic disasters. The crystal bird took flight, its song now a strange but beautiful mixture of earth melodies and Aetherian harmonies. "Can I ask you something personal?" Daho ventured. When Ara nodded, he continued, "Why didn't you ever take a partner before? Surely there were suitable candidates among your own people." Ara was quiet for a moment, her crown creating complex patterns that reflected in the garden crystals. There were many who could perform the proper rituals perfectly, who understood every protocol and pattern. But that perfection felt empty. I wanted someone who could see the music between the notes, so to speak. And you found that in someone who couldn't even perform a simple greeting correctly. He teased. "I found it in someone who tried to understand us rather than just memorize our ways," she corrected. "Do you remember the day you spent hours talking with the crystal gardeners about their work?" Daho nodded. "They were teaching me about how different emotions create different growth patterns in the crystal flowers. Most diplomats would have seen that as beneath their station, but you sat there, making the flowers grow in crooked patterns because your emotions didn't fit our usual categories." The gardeners still talk about how those imperfect growths created entirely new crystal variations. A soft chime rang through the garden, signaling the approach of evening. The crystal flowers began their nightly color change, shifting through impossible hues as the first moon rose. "There's something I've been wanting to show you," Era said, standing. "Come with me." She led him deeper into the garden, to a section he'd never seen before. Here, the crystal growths were different, less structured, more organic in their patterns. They reminded him of Earth's coral reefs. "This garden was started the day you arrived," Era explained. "Every time you made a diplomatic mistake that actually led to better understanding between our peoples, a new crystal would grow. Watch." She touched one of the formations, and suddenly the air was filled with holographic scenes. Daho accidentally using the wrong greeting and making an Aetherian child laugh for the first time in public. Him misunderstanding a formal dance and creating a new style that combined Earth and Aetherian movements. The time he spoke to the crystal birds in Korean, causing them to develop new harmonic patterns. "Each failure to follow our patterns perfectly created something new," Era said softly. "Something neither human nor Aetherian, but beautiful in its own right." Daho stared at the crystal formations, finally understanding. "Like us?" "Like us," she agreed, her crown creating a pattern he'd never seen before, one that made his heart race with its complexity and beauty. Neither of our peoples expected this union. Many still don't understand it. But perhaps that's exactly why it matters. A group of crystal birds gathered above them, their songs now a complex fusion of earth and Aetherian melodies. The garden itself seemed to resonate with their presence, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible according to either world's musical theories. "I think I'd finally understand what that ancient proposal ritual was really about," Daho said. "It wasn't just about perfect execution or genuine connection. It was about the ability to create something new together. Era's crown glowed with approval. Now you're thinking like both a human and an Aetherian, which, coincidentally, is exactly what our peoples need right now. As night fell fully, they sat together in the Garden of Mistakes, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of their combined influence on the crystal world. Tomorrow would bring more diplomatic challenges, more cultural misunderstandings to navigate, more patterns to break and rebuild. But for now, they had found understanding in their differences, harmony in their discord, and possibility in their imperfections. The crystal birds sang their impossible songs above them, proof that sometimes the most beautiful patterns are the ones that break all the rules. The day of the royal wedding dawned with both of Aetheria Prime's moons still visible in the morning sky. The crystal spires of the palace sang with anticipation, their harmonies a complex blend of traditional Aetherian songs and earth melodies. Inside his preparation chamber, Daho stood before a mirror, trying to make sense of his ceremonial attire. "Stop fidgeting," Minister Rin scolded, adjusting the crystal components of his formal wear. "These are living crystals. They respond to your emotions. Your nervousness is making them change color." Indeed, the crystalline elements of his outfit were shifting between shades of blue and green, reflecting his anxious state. After 3 months of preparation, the day had finally arrived. "I still can't believe this is happening," he said, watching as another crystal changed from azure to emerald. "A year ago, I was a junior diplomat who couldn't even perform a proper greeting. And now you're about to become the first human Aetherian royal consort in history." Rin's crown sparkled with amusement. The universe has a strange sense of humor. The ceremony would combine both Earth and Aetherian traditions, something never attempted before. Through the window, Daho could see the great crystal dome of the ceremonial hall, where thousands of guests from both worlds had gathered. "It's time," announced Liz, entering the chamber. His former cultural advisor now served as his chief of staff, her crown creating patterns of excited anticipation. "The Queen awaits." The walk to the ceremonial hall felt both endless and too short. Guards in living crystal armor lined the corridors, their formations creating complex light patterns that danced across the walls. As they approached the great doors, Daho heard the combined sounds of Earth's classical music and Aetherian crystal harmonies, a new composition created specifically for this day. The doors opened, revealing a sight that took his breath away. The vast hall was filled with light and music. Humans and Aetherians sat together, their differences highlighted and celebrated rather than hidden. Above them, crystal birds flew in formation, their songs adding to the symphony. But all of this faded when Daho saw Era. She stood at the far end of the hall, her ceremonial robes seeming to capture and amplify every ray of light. Her crown had been transformed into something entirely new, a fusion of traditional Aetherian patterns and elements inspired by Earth's natural forms. When their eyes met across the distance, her crown created a pattern he now recognized as love. The ceremony itself was a beautiful chaos of mixed traditions. They exchanged Earth-style vows in both Korean and the musical language of the Aetherians. They performed the ancient crystal bonding ritual, but with modifications that allowed for human participation. When Daho accidentally created a new harmonic pattern during one of the traditional songs, the crystal birds immediately adapted their melody to match it, creating something unexpected and beautiful. "This is perfect," Era whispered during a quiet moment in the ceremony, her crown creating patterns that made the surrounding crystals sing. Not despite the mistakes, but because of them. The formal joining of their hands created a resonance that spread through the entire palace, causing every crystal to glow with new colors. The human guests gasped in wonder, while the Aetherians' crowns flickered with amazement. Such a reaction was unprecedented. Minister Rin, who was conducting the ceremony, smiled knowingly. Perhaps, she announced to the gathered crowd, this is what the ancient texts meant when they spoke of harmonies yet undiscovered, the joining of different melodies to create new songs. After the ceremony came the celebrations. Humans attempted Aetherian dances, while the Etherians tried Earth's traditional moves, creating hybrid styles that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The crystal birds above them incorporated both worlds' music into their songs, their voices carrying the promise of something new being born. Late in the evening, Daho and Era escaped to their special garden, the one that had grown from their mistakes. The crystal formations had evolved, creating patterns that combined the mathematical precision of Aetherian designs with the organic chaos of Earth's natural growth. "Look," Era said, pointing to a new crystal formation that had grown during the ceremony. "It's responding to both of us equally now. Neither human nor Aetherian, but something new." Daho touched the crystal gently, feeling its resonance, like the future we're building. "Exactly," she smiled, her crown creating patterns that reflected in every crystal around them. "A future where differences don't divide us, but make us stronger." Above them, the twin moons of Aetheria Prime shared the sky with visible stars that would lead back to Earth. The crystal birds sang their impossible songs, carrying notes from both worlds in perfect harmony. In the palace behind them, humans and Aetherians continued their celebrations, learning each other's ways and creating new ones together. "You know," Daho said thoughtfully, "when I first arrived here, I thought my job was to learn how to be more like an Aetherian. Now I understand that wasn't the point at all." Era's crown created a pattern of questioning. "Oh, the point wasn't to become like each other, but to learn how our differences could create something greater than either of us could achieve alone." A crystal flower bloomed beside them, its pattern unlike anything seen before on either world. It sang with a voice that combined Earth's chaos and Aetheria's precision, creating a melody that would have been impossible just a year ago. "To the future," Era said, her voice carrying both royal authority and personal joy. "May it be as beautifully imperfect as we are." The crystal garden sang around them, its voice carrying their story to the stars, a tale of mistakes that turned out to be destiny, of differences that became strengths, and of two very different beings who found perfection in their imperfect union. As the last light of day faded, the crystal birds above sang a new song, one that would be remembered for generations on both worlds. It was a song of hope, of change, and of the endless possibilities that arise when different worlds dare to dream together. The future stretched before them, as vast and full of potential as the space between their worlds. It would not always be easy. There would be misunderstandings, challenges, and plenty more diplomatic incidents. But now they understood that these weren't obstacles to overcome, but opportunities to create something new and wonderful. In the end, that was their greatest discovery, that love, like the universe itself, grows stronger not through perfect symmetry, but through the beautiful chaos of different patterns learning to dance together. *, the end*.